Well, the time is just gone 8:39 a.m. as we continue this morning, and we are now taking a look at the G20 summit, the aftermath, and trying to unpack some of the key issues. And Minara Chamber of Commerce's Ebrahim Patel was present at the summit, and just to unpack his thoughts on the summit as well, and what are some of the possible outcomes as far as the summit is concerned. So, this is a recorded interview which we had to do earlier on. So, let's sit back and take a listen and a look to what Ibrahim Patel had to say regarding the G20 summit.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Once again, as we welcome our listeners, our viewers back on the program. And we are now going to do some sort of an analysis and also an understanding as to what came out of the G20 summit. Now, as the G20 summit drew to a close, and for the first time, this influential forum had actually gathered on African soil. We've seen some of the feedback where South Africa has been praised for hosting the summit. But what did this actually mean? Because this was a gathering of world leaders, minus the United States, obviously. But what a sort of profound test has the G20 summit put to the multilateral system, but more importantly, against some of the geopolitical tensions and also in terms of the global economy, the global debt problem that persists. And joining us today is Minara Chambers' Ebrahim Patel. Ebrahim, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome and Jazakallah khairan so much for your time.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Inayat, and shukran for having me here with you this evening.
Yes, Ebrahim, obviously we are trying to unpack the G20 summit, and you attended the G20 summit, and South Africa obviously being praised, hailed for hosting such a dynamic and a very influential event, for want of a better term. Just your view, your initial take on how the summit has gone.
I think it was a feather in the cap for South Africa. It is one of those historic moments in our timeline. If I trace 1994, the elections, the euphoria that surrounded us, the 2010 World Cup that brought the nation together, and this G20 summit has really, really brought various aspects of our society together. And I think there was a sense of euphoria and optimism in our country during this period. We've carried it out with a great deal of success. If we look at the actual summit itself, the programs that have taken place over the entire year. So we must also remember that the G20 was not just that 2 days that took place at Nasrec on the Friday and Saturday and Sunday, but it's actually the entire year, the meetings that took place. So, you had the deputy ministers meetings that took place, you had the finance ministers meetings that took place. There were various task teams and various other subcommittees whose meetings took place throughout the entire year. And I think that scale and that enormity of that planning and execution is something that we need to be proud of as South Africans.
Ibrahim, just to understand, and as I mentioned, that this was a very influential forum, but also in terms of the world leaders tackling the agenda, that is playing out right across the entire world, whether we're talking about geopolitical tensions, whether we're talking about the climate crisis, whether we're talking about the debt problem. Now, this is quite a formidable agenda to actually tackle, considering that there is this great divide in this world. We always talk about the global north, global south. Yet when we look at these leaders that came together, let's just try and understand the complexities of tackling some of these formidable issues.
Before I get into that, Inayat, I think perhaps some background into the South Africa's presidency of the G20. So remember that South Africa is the only country on the African continent that is a direct member of the G20. The African Union is a +1 member of the G20, which is admitted in 2023. But South Africa remains the only country on the African continent that is a member of the G20. And under South Africa's presidency, there were three themes that were very, very much the focus, and that was around how South Africa positioned the G20 and South Africa's use the G20 platform to position both Africa's development in finance, in technology, in trade. Those principles precipitated throughout all those task teams. And so South Africa's great focus was, so you introduced the program talking about multilateralism, but we must also bear in mind that we are in a world that is now becoming multipolar as well. So, in the past, it was very easy to define. The world was either the West or Russia, the communist and the capitalist system, and you had two poles of power. Then you had the introduction of China, which became a third pole of power. But now those are all disintegrating, and there are changes in the political relationships across the world. And so you're finding BRICS is starting in 2022, a partner nation to the ASEAN, so ASEAN being the Southeast Asian nations. South Africa is the first country in Africa to be at ASEAN, which means it gives it a great relationship. We're also having this relationship that's going on with Turkey. So for South Africa, all these multipolar relationships that it has into a multilateralism system, and try to position the agenda of both the African continent and the global South. And if we look at the programs that took place, in that declaration is a very fantastic document. It's a very long document, but confined within that declaration are three main items that stand out for me. One was, how do we create equality in trade? That means overcome those tariff barriers, those barriers between the various trading blocks that have existed and the various trading nations. That was as a mitigation towards American influence, and at the same time, the opening up of the African continent through the African continent. The second part of that is, and that huge aspect of issue that faces the developing world is the finance that is burdened rated negatively by Western rating agencies. The cost of borrowing is significantly higher than it would be for other countries across the globe. And so South Africa has championed that there should be a more equitable rating mechanism, therefore debt funding. So looking at alternatives, and if I recall, President Ramaphosa at the B20, with the Business 20 summit that was taken on the sidelines of the G20, he mentioned very clearly that we don't want, in African nations and in development countries, we don't want the traditional debt financing models that existed out of the World Bank and the IMF, but rather we should look at how investment can be created in those countries to drive the development agenda. So turning the whole funding issue away from pure debt funding to an investment in equity funding. So we're now seeing this emergence of blended financing models, and it has come about a great deal in the just energy transition. So, if we go back to just energy transition, is about how do we harness this change from fossil fuels to that as an opportunity. And interestingly enough, there seems to be a great deal more focus on financial systems that are risk-based partnership and equity, which are very similar to the Islamic financing transaction models that we have. And so that Islam, we are nations in funding infrastructure development, in funding the development that those countries, and in creating funding mechanisms for particularly the SMEs to unlock the economy. And I think that Islamic finance is great for that.
This was quite a high stake. He saw that has got the capacity to host a global G20 summit. The key issue here is about finding common ground. That there was a global agreement, and also issues surrounding global health, pandemic readiness. These issues obviously were discussed. The key issue here is, and where the skepticism has always been, and perhaps, you could just elaborate on this, that, should we be skeptical in terms of the agreements, in terms of the outcomes? Was this just